Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the inventors and the inventions during the Second Industrial Revolution. And you're going to start hearing some names of some important inventors that you might have heard previously in school. So the first Industrial Revolution in the United States occurred during a time in our history that seemed to correlate with two predominantly major driving events. The end of the American Revolution was signaled with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, and America's Second War of Independence, the War of 1812, was fought less than 30 years later. So whether it be a new type of weapon or transportation, in many cases, times of warfare tend to bring out new technological advances, and the Second Industrial Revolution is no different. The Second Industrial Revolution changed America during the mid-19th century, and it still makes an impact today. There are many inventions that were created then that we still use today, or at least have been improved on and updated with today's technology. So someone can argue that the revolution began again during wartime, when these new technologies like ironclad ships were invented during the Civil War to gain an edge over the enemy on rivers and in the ocean. And the final years of the war and the post-war era really started the pathway for the industrious nation that we are today. The vast amounts of these soldiers from the Civil War that returned back to the North to work long hours in the factories really aided in the effort to invent or create new ideas and technologies that would spread quickly throughout America. Our nation was pretty much set up for success. So we had three factors that led to the revolution. And they were, number one, the vast openness of the United States supplied the industry with an enormous amount of natural resources. Our democracy was a driving factor. And finally, our free enterprise economy really were the driving forces to the explosion of these technological and economic growth that led to the Second Industrial Revolution in the time period between 1870 and 1914, the beginning of World War I, and we call this time the Gilded Age. So the second wave of immigration gave the North an ample supply of unskilled and underpaid labor sources, and it was these sources that fed the fire of growth. And this mass production of goods were at levels that we have never seen before. The rapid rise of these factories truly helped lead to the boom period of the Second Industrial Revolution. The transportation network in the United States spread like wildfire with the introduction of the Bessemer process, and by the end of the 19th century, the United States had overtaken England in the output of coal and iron, and even in the consumption of southern cotton. Britain was falling by the wayside because of its outdated factories and machines. They were not updating them at all. And competition was increasing throughout Europe and the United States with new chemical creations and electrical components, and the automobile industry exploded in the early 20th century, which was revolutionized with the invention of the assembly line by Henry Ford. The same assembly line that is used throughout the world today on pretty much everything that we produce or manufacture in the United States. Now, there were a variety of key components that went into the success of the industry that led to our boom. The first one we're going to go over is called the Bessemer process. And prior to the Bessemer process, steel was expensive, and it was manufactured in small batches to make things like knives, swords, or armor. However, when Henry Bessemer came up with a new way of producing steel by bulk, the world would change forever. Henry Bessemer was an English inventor that created one of the most important techniques in creating steel during the 19th century that dominated the world between the 1850s and 1950s, about 100 years. The Bessemer process was a cheaper and more efficient way to turn iron into steel by using a quick blast of air during the molten process to remove all the impurities. And steel production increased from 77,000 tons in 1870 to more than 1 million tons in 1879. So the Bessemer process helped lower the cost of steel dramatically, and because of this, the cost of railroads and buildings were decreased as well. Steel railroads in the United States dropped from about $40 a rail down to about $25 a rail by 1900. So this really meant a large sale or a large expansion of the railroad. And near the turn of the century, steel was the reason for the railroad and the construction booms across the United States. The Industrial Revolution made an impact on river transportation as well in the beginning of the 19th century, when the majority of the steamboats started using steel as their hull, and on land, the steam engine railroad began its quest across the nation. And by 1850, there were roughly 9,000 miles of track laid in the United States, and by 1860, that number increased only to about 30,000 miles, which was predominantly in the north. And aided by land grants, the number only increased to about 35,000 by the end of the Civil War. But because of mass production, or what mass production is the large production of standard products, in the next 30 years, the miles of track that were laid down in America more than quadrupled to about 200,000 miles of track. By the turn of the century, a nationwide network of railroads transported people and goods faster, more efficiently, and cheaper from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So the nation was now connected by the railroad, and as the railroad expanded, so did the technology that aided it. In 1859, George Pullman developed a sleeping car that gave travelers a comfortable place to sleep on the train overnight, making long trips more enjoyable. And in 1869, George Westinghouse invented the air brake to stop these fast-moving trains. The railroad connected America, and people were traveling out west in droves. Upon the arrival, many took up homesteads and stayed for a lot of years afterwards. However, the expansive population growth in the United States that was occurring was in the urban areas. Cities like New York, St. Louis, Chicago are now starting to feel the strain of overpopulation. So prior to the Second Industrial Revolution and the mass production of steel, buildings needed to be built wide and short to accommodate the masses of the people in the cities. These old wood and brick buildings couldn't handle the load of a structure more than 5 or 10 stories tall, because the weight of the material would just bring the structure crashing down. So during the Revolution, these new materials like glass, concrete, and steel, predominantly steel, were used to build these newest forms of factories and business centers of the Gilded Age, what we call the skyscrapers. And the skyscrapers were built using tons of steel and were able to reach heights that were almost unbelievable during the time. But because skyscrapers were built higher, they had a smaller footprint, so you could put many more factories and many more tenements in these cities, jamming them in there, which would really cause many social issues. So early technological advances in communication saw the invention of the telegraph machine. The telegraph, along with this Morse code, many Civil War soldiers and commanders made communication easier and more efficient during the war. After the war, many Americans used the telegraph in their day-to-day life. And in 1866, telegraph technology connected the United States and Britain by a cable, making faster communication across the Atlantic Ocean. They were able to run a telegraph line across the Atlantic to make communication between the United States and Great Britain. The Second Industrial Revolution built upon the telegraph technology and made it better. That's what the Industrial Revolutions do. And in 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, and in 1877, the Bell Telephone Company was formed. Telephones were adopted by many Americans when, in 4 years since its invention, nearly 55,000 telephones were in use, and by 1900 there were over 1.5 million. The year 1900 also coincides with the year that the American Telephone and Telegraph Company was created, a company today known simply as AT&T. We had some energy sources coming out in this industrial age. We mentioned this in our first video. It saw new types of power sources being used that were more efficient than the old sources. Chemists created a way to transform crude oil into a new fuel source called kerosene. And starting in 1853, a cleaner burning kerosene lamp replaced the old whale oil lamps. Kerosene had all sorts of purposes, from like cooking and heating and lighting, and a demand for this oil helped develop a more efficient way of pumping the oil from the ground in 1859. Factories in the Industrial Age were being powered by coal and now oil and electricity. Thomas Edison was one of the greatest inventors in American history. He held over 1,000 patents, and he worked tirelessly on arguably his most famous and life-changing invention, the longer-lasting light bulb. Edison would also go on to invent the phonograph, which was a type of record player, and he would also start the nation's first electric generation stations. However, during what was to be called the Battle of the Currents, one of Edison's greatest competitors, George Westinghouse, developed an alternating current that could travel longer distances. So now these wires could spread across the nation, spreading a cheaper and more efficient energy source, electricity. So we've gone over some inventors, Edison and Westinghouse and Bell, and we've gone over the Bessemer process, the quick way to make steel. You can see the railroad is getting big. We're going to go over a couple of more inventors. The next one, the Wright brothers. Then we're going to go over the railroad. We're going to really hammer down on those and give you some extra information on those during the Gilded Age.